Victor Noble Rainbird twice found himself in a trench, and on both occasions he was given a number, put amongst strangers and surrounded by the dead.
The first time was about 450 miles south of North Shields in France during World War I.
His number was 38539, and there were thousands in that trench with him.
Victor got out that trench after 5 years, but not as the same man that entered it. You will find no mark of his time there.
20 years later, he entered the second trench, this one in his hometown of North Shields.
Once more, he was given a number, 11405, and unlike the first one, he shared this trench with just 2 strangers. He is still in that trench over 8 years after he entered it.
Until 2016, he would have found no marker of his time there, other than a small piece of rough timber with his surname and number on it.
We've learnt that many artists have been born in North Shields or made the town their home, but none are remembered with such affection as Victor Noble Rainbird.
Victor was born in this house on December 12, 1887. His mother was a teacher. His father left the family when Victor was just a baby.
Both boys went to Christ Church School in Shields. Victor worked hard and did well at school, and it is clear, even as a child, he was a gifted artist.
Although we all live close to North Shields, we didn't know who Victor was before this project.
I thought North Shields was all about fishing.
Yeah, and the river.
Look at the date of the painting. It's over 100 years old. I love that painting with the 2 women in.
I know, it looks like it should be hanging in a gallery somewhere.
I think we need to find out a bit more. We need an expert. We know Victor was a good artist even when he was very young, but how did he become a full-time artist?
When he left the Christ Church School and his parents wanted him to go into accountancy, he knew it wasn't right. So what he continued to do is he went to night school and he learned his art at night school. And then from there, eventually his mum decided that she would let him go to university, and he went into what was then the Armstrong College, which is now Newcastle University. So he impressed his teachers that much when he was at Armstrong College. They decided that they would nominate him or recommend him to the most famous art school in the country, which at that time was the Royal Academy.
What did the Royal Academy do for Victor?
While he was there, he was lucky enough to win what they call the Landseer Scholarship, which was basically only given to 1 student a year, and Victor managed to win that, which gave him a lump of money for 2 years so that he didn't have to worry about where his next meal was coming from. But he did very, very well there, and he was exposed to a lot of other great artists, and his talent and his purpose as an artist grew during his time at the Royal Academy.
What makes a great artist?
Rainbird had a massive energy, and that energy came out in his paintings. And really, to be a great artist, I think the painting has got to say something to you. It's got to set something away emotionally inside you. So, you know, it's got to make you cry. It's got to make you laugh. It's got to make you have empathy. It's got to make you look at the painting and try to understand what the artist is saying to you in the painting. And I honestly believe Victor had that.
Was Victor a great artist?
Many of his great, what I would term his great paintings, unfortunately disappeared. So we can't look back at those and comment on them. So it's a very difficult question to answer. But from a personal level, yeah, I honestly believe he was a great artist.
Life had changed dramatically for Victor, from his humble childhood in North Shields to Armstrong College and onto the Royal Academy in London. It must have seemed that the promise of a future life as an artist was assured. But in 1914, the whole world was turned upside down, and no one could have imagined the terrible effect the war would have had on Victor and how that promise would be broken.
World War I began in 1914, and Victor, along with thousands of other young men just like him, volunteered to fight. He joined the Royal Academy Officer Training Corps, but soon returned to the North East and joined the Northumberland Fusiliers as a private. He was posted to the Western Front as a fighting man. Because of his skill as an artist, the army had other plans for Victor.
We invited Dr. Dan Jackson, who had studied this period of history, to our school to find out more about the war and what Victor would have faced.
Why did young men like Victor volunteer for this war?
Well, good question. The first reason they volunteered, I think, is because they were asked to. Britain found itself at war in 1914, and they quickly realised that the army was too small, and they needed more men, quickly. So you may have seen the famous poster with Lord Kitchener's face on it when he's pointing at you saying, "Britons, we want you." And a lot of people saw that poster and thought, OK then, we'll join up, the country's in danger. We are the part of the country that in the northeast that faces Germany across the North Sea. We were at war with Germany, so people thought, well, best do my bit then.
What were the conditions like for the soldiers in the trenches of the Western Front?
Now, soldiers would typically spend a week or two in the front line in those trenches, and the conditions were pretty unpleasant because of the mud, like I said, but also because of the rats that were drawn to the trenches because of the presence of dead bodies. There could be the presence of disease sometimes because, I've got to be honest, the toilet facilities weren't great. It wasn't exactly luxurious to be fighting in the trenches. It was scary as well because sometimes you'd have to fight off a German attack and they would come in waves towards the British trenches. Or more often, you'd be under shell fire. And that was really scary because you never knew if a shell was going to land on you or not.
What was no man's land and how dangerous was it?
Well, no man's land was the area between the two lines of trenches. So what basically happened was there's these miles and miles and miles of trenches went all the way from the English Channel to the French border with Switzerland. So that's hundreds of miles long. And so the British and the French dug these trenches, and then typically about half a mile away, the Germans did the same. So that in essence, there's these two parallel lines matching each other for all that distance. And the gap between those two trenches was called no man's land, because no man should really go into that area unless there's a battle in progress. So people tended to keep out of those areas. But when there was a big set-piece battle, the job of the soldier was, and it took some real guts to do this, was to climb out of the trenches and advance towards the other side, across no man's land. And that was really, really dangerous.
What use was an artist like Victor to the British Army?
When they found out he was an artist, they thought, wouldn't it be a good idea if we got Victor to go and sketch what the German positions looked like? Because both sides were always trying to spy on each other and find out what they were up to. And because cameras were a bit limited, drones hadn't been invented yet, they asked if Victor would go and sketch the German lines. So that's what he did, and that took some real courage to crawl out of the trench and head into no man's land, as we discussed earlier, how dangerous that was, and to go and sketch the German lines. So they put Victor's skills to good use.
I can't believe Victor was sent out into no man's land and all he had with him was the stuff in this bag.
Well, he couldn't take much because he had to crawl through mud and barbed wire to get where he needed to be.
Some of the things he saw were terrible. He must have had nightmares for the rest of his life. How would Victor have even gotten close enough to make drawings of the enemy's positions?
Well, we do know that Victor headed out into no man's land by himself. We don't even know if he took any weapons with him to defend himself. It may have been that he just had his sketching materials, pencil and sketch pad and so on. So maybe because he was by himself, he was travelling light, he was able to sneak up quite closely right up to the German lines without being noticed.
How did soldiers cope with all the awful things they saw during the war?
Well, a lot of soldiers didn't really cope all that well, to be honest. And we know from Victor's own life story that when he got home after the end of the war, he really struggled with what we might call post-traumatic stress disorder. And his life fell apart in many respects because he was so traumatised by what he'd seen. Seeing some of his friends being killed, living in constant danger, really took a toll on people, on their mental health.
Victor suffered gas attacks, constant shelling, and on one occasion was about to be buried with other casualties because he appeared to be dead. He was only saved because a soldier saw his thumb twitching and dragged him out of the grave.
Unlike millions of other men, Victor survived and carried no physical injuries from his time in France, but mentally he was a changed man when he returned home into North Shields.
Victor came home to North Shields after the war and lived with his mother, wife and son here at 71 West Percy Street. He received no help for his shell shock and was a totally broken man. His dream of becoming a famous artist and the energy he had put into his early work had been destroyed by his experience in the war, and he never really fulfilled the promise he'd shown as a young man.
What happened to Victor when he came home from war?
I think the very fact he came back to North Shields tells you something about it. If he was as ambitious as what he was before he went to war, I don't think he would have come back to North Shields. I think he would have headed straight to London, which is where the great art scene was. So what he did was, his typical day, he would wake up in the morning, he would stick some cheap paper out, he would do some scene in the foreground, something in the background. He'd put it in front of the fire so it dried quickly. The materials he would be using would be very, very poor. And he would take those finished pieces and he would stick them under his arm and he would go out to Shields and he would basically use those as his currency. Eventually he got into drinking because he wanted to forget the horrors of war. His art became second place. He could still do it. He still produced great art, but his talent, his passion had gone. His talent was still there. His passion had gone.
Sadly, in the years that followed, Victor's family broke apart. Unable to cope with his drinking and the effects the war had on his mental health, his wife and son left him. In 1935, at a low point in his life, Victor moved to stay with friends in Sunderland, and they helped heal his nightmares.
He began to paint again, but by then he was becoming very sick and was diagnosed with throat cancer, maybe as a result of the gas attacks he suffered in France. Victor Noble Rainbird died on March the 8th, 1936. He was only 48 years old.
He was so poor that when his body was brought back to North Shields, he was buried in a pauper's grave, where the council bury you as cheaply as possible and without a headstone, just a stick in the ground with his name on it.
The only words Victor ever wrote about his war were found on the back of a painting he gave to a friend in York. It said,
"To my beloved Jane, let this be a token of friendship, and may it be so forever. The France ordeal was too awful to write about, but it's over now, and I have memories that will never perish. How can mankind be so savage to each other?"
If you look closely at this picture, you'll see a soldier lying dead at the feet of the angel. Victor's own army number is written on the dead man's pack. Maybe this is Victor's way of telling us that the young artist he was actually died on the fields of France.
Victor's grave remained unmarked for another 80 years, until Dave Young and some friends organised an exhibition for his work at the Old Lowlight Heritage Centre on the Fish Quay to raise money for a proper headstone so people would know who Victor was and where he lies.
Hundreds of people attended the exhibition, and many of them brought in their own Rainbird paintings and told amazing stories of how Victor had given the art to a grandparent or great-grandparent in exchange for food, drink, and sometimes even somewhere to stay for the night. The people of North Shields remembered Victor, and very quickly £6,000 was raised.
Local sculptor Neil Talbot hand-carved this headstone from a piece of solid sandstone. At the unveiling in 2016, a bugler from the Northumberland Fusiliers played the last post over the grave as a mark of respect.
Victor's story is one of huge promise destroyed by the effects of war. Who knows what he could have achieved had the war not happened? But as this film shows, he is fondly remembered by the people of his hometown and his memory lives on.